Some houses do not let go of their dead, and some men spend their lives running from ghosts that were never truly chasing them. As Edward Ashford stood before Ravenshade Manor, the morning fog curled like grasping fingers around its time-worn walls, whispering secrets only the forgotten could hear. He had sworn never to return, never to face what lurked in its shadows. Yet here he was, drawn back by a past that refused to be buried, by questions that clawed at his mind in the dead of night. The house was waiting, and so was something inside it, something that had been waiting far longer than him. The golden mist of dawn clung to the towering spires of Hawthorne Manor, wrapping around its ivy-draped walls like the whispered remnants of forgotten secrets. The mansion loomed over the quiet countryside, an ancient spectre watching over a world that had long since moved on. Time had etched its mysteries into the very bones of this house. Echoes of clandestine meetings, conspiracies murmured in dimly lit corridors, and betrayals buried beneath centuries of polished wood and heavy velvet drapery. The manor was not merely a home, it was a monument to the past, a silent guardian of untold stories, standing apart from the world, as if protecting something that should never be disturbed. The gravel driveway coiled toward its entrance, where the air carried the scent of damp earth and the last fading roses of autumn. Somewhere deep within, the solemn chime of an old clock counted the passing moments, a reminder that time, despite its weight, never truly stopped. Inside, the grand library lay untouched, a cathedral of forgotten knowledge, where only the dust motes dared to dance in the slivers of pale morning light. Towering bookshelves stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, their worn spines marked with symbols and inscriptions long lost to memory. The rich Persian carpets silenced footsteps, and the dim glow from the chandeliers cast elongated shadows against mahogany paneling. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment, beeswax polish, and something else, something more elusive, like a thought left unfinished, hovering just beyond reach. At the far end of the room, near the grand bay window, stood Lady Helena Hawthorne, motionless, poised. She was carved from the same cold elegance as the marble statues that adorned the estate gardens. Dressed in mourning hues, though she had worn black far beyond what propriety dictated, she was a woman defined by quiet resilience. Her pale hands rested lightly on the velvet drapes, as if tethering herself to the present, though the faint lines around her eyes spoke of restless nights and burdens unspoken. The silence broke with the soft shuffle of measured footsteps. Mr. Sloane, the butler, had entered, his expression composed, his silver hair neatly combed back, yet something in the set of his jaw hinted at unease. "Madam," he said, his voice like the ticking of a well-worn clock, "there is an issue in the East Wing." Helena exhaled slowly, her gaze remaining on the mist-laden fields beyond the glass. "Miss Hathaway again?" she asked, a faint trace of amusement in her tone. The housekeeper was competent but prone to superstition, always seeing shadows where there were none. Sloane hesitated, an almost imperceptible pause. "No, madam," he said carefully, "this is something else." The library seemed to listen. The house itself felt as though it had drawn a breath. Helena's fingers curled slightly against the fabric before she turned, her movements deliberate and unhurried. As she stepped away from the window, the library seemed to sigh, a space reluctant to release its solitary dominion. Beyond the heavy oak doors, the corridors of Hawthorne Manor stretched into hushed eternity. Portraits of long-dead ancestors lined the high walls, their painted eyes holding secrets of their own. The air carried the faint trace of lavender polish, and the lingering smokiness of a dying fire. Somewhere ahead, voices murmured in hushed tones, a ripple of unease moving through the gathered servants. Near the entrance to the East Wing stood Miss Hathaway, her usual formidable presence diminished by the way she clutched at the edges of her apron. "Madam," she curtsied quickly, her gaze flickering toward a door at the far end of the corridor. "I did not wish to alarm you, but—" She hesitated. Helena followed her gaze. The door led to an old study, one that had remained locked for months. It was unremarkable in every way, except now. Now the heavy iron lock hung askew, barely holding the door closed. "What did you hear?" Helena asked softly. Miss Hathaway's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron. "A noise," she whispered. "In the night. Someone moving inside." A silence stretched between them. "But that room has been locked for months," she finished, barely above a breath. Helena did not respond immediately, but something flickered in her expression, something unspoken. Slowly, she turned to Sloane.
"Fetch the keys."
Sloane gave a single nod before disappearing into the dimly lit corridor. In the quiet that followed, the gathered servants murmured amongst themselves, their voices rising and falling like the tide. Somewhere in the house, a distant clock chimed again, marking the passage of time. But for those standing outside that forgotten study, time had already paused, holding its breath, waiting. The air in the dim corridor seemed to shudder as Helena pushed open the door, the iron key still warm from her grasp. Dust curled in the disturbed air, catching the pale morning light like restless spirits awoken from slumber. The study had remained locked for months, untouched, yet someone had been here. The great mahogany desk bore the imprint of movement, a chair pushed back just slightly from its original place, its feet dragging a whisper across the wooden floor. The lamp on the side table, though unlit now, carried the faint scent of burnt wick, as if it had been extinguished mere hours ago. But it was the desk that drew her in, the very center of the room, where a single scrap of parchment lay, unnervingly precise, as though placed with intent. Her breath hitched as she stepped closer, the aged wood creaking beneath her measured steps. Ink, fresh and glistening, bled into the rough fibers of the paper. 3 words. Just 3. "He knows everything." A chill laced its fingers through the air, an invisible presence stirring in the silence. Behind her the gathered servants stood frozen in the doorway, their faces pale, their gazes shifting between one another in uneasy apprehension. Outside the wind stirred the ivy-clad walls, a rustling murmur against the ancient stones, as if the house itself had exhaled. Somewhere in the distance, a floorboard creaked, not here, but elsewhere, within the vast expanse of the estate. Watching, waiting. By the time breakfast was served in the grand dining hall, tension coiled through the air like an unsprung trap. The room, a testament to restrained grandeur, bore the weight of history in every carved panel and flickering candle. Heavy velvet drapes framed the windows, filtering the pale morning light into long shadows that stretched across the polished mahogany table. Portraits of ancestors long dead lined the walls, their gazes locked in an eternal watchfulness, their expressions unreadable. But among the living, the atmosphere was far from composed. Silverware clinked against porcelain, a too loud sound in the hush that had settled over the household. At the head of the table, Lady Helena sat in composed silence, her movements measured, her gaze veiled beneath a mask of quiet contemplation. Across from her, Edward Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, his shirt slightly rumpled, the sharp line of his jaw shadowed with the beginnings of sleepless neglect. His fingers drummed idly against the table, his gaze fixed, unreadable. "You look as though you've been up all night," Helena observed, her tone carrying an edge of casual disinterest, though her eyes missed nothing. Edward exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Perhaps I have been, mother. You should try sleeping," she said, lifting her teacup with deliberate ease. "Ah, but I find that difficult in a house where secrets whisper through the walls," Edward murmured, his voice a shade too light, too amused. He glanced toward the staff. "Or is it ghosts now? The household seems rather convinced." Miss Hathaway, standing by the sideboard, stiffened but said nothing. The butler, Sloane, remained impassive, though there was a flicker of something, discomfort, in his otherwise unreadable expression. The visiting scholar, Dr. James Atwood, shifted slightly, the candlelight catching the gold rims of his spectacles. A man of careful observation and impeccable restraint, he had thus far remained silent, merely watching. Now, however, he spoke, his tone measured. "It does seem rather curious," he mused, stirring his tea with absent precision, "that such disturbances should begin now, of all times." Helena's gaze turned to him, her fingers pausing just a moment before she set her teacup down with a barely audible clink. "What do you mean, Doctor Atwood?" A moment of silence stretched between them, the tension curling unseen between the flickering candle flames. The house, old and knowing, seemed to listen. Somewhere beyond the heavy doors, a clock chimed the hour, marking the passage of time. But to those seated around the table, time had already begun to slip, drawing them deeper into something unseen, something waiting in the dark corners of Hawthorne Manor. The flickering candlelight barely touched the far corners of the dining hall, where shadows stretched long and uncertain. Atwood adjusted his glasses, his fingers resting briefly against the bridge of his nose before he spoke. "Merely that disturbances in this house coincide, rather conveniently, with the uncovering of certain historical curiosities." His tone was measured, but something in his words unsettled the room. Eloise smirked, the candlelight catching in her dark eyes. "Are we speaking of ghosts, Atwood, or the manuscript?" The scholar hesitated, his usual self-assurance wavering. "You know very well what I am referring to." A hush fell, as if the house itself had ceased to breathe. Mr. Lorne, the curator, cleared his throat, his voice dry as old parchment. "Professor Langley was rather insistent about his theories," he muttered, glancing toward Lady Helena, before lowering his gaze. "Perhaps a touch too insistent." There it was, the unspoken weight hanging over them all, the man whose research had stirred something best, left buried. And now, of course, the man who was dead. Lady Helena's expression was unreadable, as she folded her hands before her. "Do be careful, Lorne. You tread rather close to impropriety." "Forgive me, Lady Helena," Lorne murmured, but his fingers drummed lightly against his teacup. "I simply mean to say, some inquiries are better left undisturbed." "And yet," Edward Hawthorne interjected, his voice deceptively light, "we invited Langley here, did we not? We set him loose in the library, let him dig through the dust of centuries." His gaze lingered on his mother. "Or was that only your decision?" Lady Helena met his stare, unwavering. "You seem terribly eager to imply that I had something to gain from his presence, Edward." "Did you?" Before she could answer, the sharp sound of metal against porcelain echoed through the hall. Miss Hathaway had dropped a spoon. The housekeeper bent swiftly, her hands shaking as she retrieved it. Edward smirked. "The staff do seem rather unsettled, don't they?" Atwood exhaled, setting his teacup down with deliberate precision. "It is reasonable for them to be," he said carefully. "After all, a man is dead." Another silence. Tighter, unyielding. Lady Helena straightened slightly. "Dr. Atwood, I do hope you are not attempting to stir unease among the household. This is a house of order, not speculation." The scholar inclined his head. "My apologies, Lady Helena. I simply observe, and as an academic, I find that history often has a way of—" He hesitated, as if selecting the right words would change the truth of them, repeating itself. Edward let out a short laugh. How ominous. Miles away, the village of Ravenshade drowsed beneath a hush of autumn mist. At the edge of a narrow lane, inside a sunlit tea-room, an old woman stirred a cup of Earl Grey with absent-minded precision. Agatha Merrow was in no hurry, a woman of modest stature with silver hair tucked neatly beneath a felt hat. She appeared to be preoccupied with the lacework in her lap. That, of course, was a mistake. Outside the window she observed the quiet rhythm of village life, the postman making his rounds, the butcher's boy balancing a crate, the hurried whispers exchanged between two women by the baker's shop, and then a name, Hawthorne. It drifted toward her on the wind, unguarded, careless. Terrible business, they say. The professor's death wasn't natural, you know. The library. Agatha's lips twitched slightly, barely a motion, but her eyes, blue, unassuming, and far too keen, gleamed with something knowing. She set her cup down, and so the world kept turning, unaware that an old woman with a penchant for lacework and quiet observation had begun, ever so subtly, to take notice. The first light of dawn had barely begun to seep through the towering windows of Hawthorne Estate's library when the grand doors creaked open. Mr. Hargreaves, the estate's long-serving caretaker, stepped inside, the damp morning air clinging to his coat. Silence pressed thickly against the walls. This was a room made for secrets. The towering mahogany shelves, looming over the polished floor, the great brass chandelier, dulled by time and shadows, the hush of dust, disturbed only by the weight of history. Hargreaves moved through the vast chamber, his routine unremarkable, drawing the curtains, checking the hearth. But something stopped him, a presence, a wrongness in the stillness. His gaze landed on the great wooden desk. There at the very center, where nothing should have been, a single sheet of parchment rested. The ink glistened, not yet fully dry. Someone had been here. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer, breath shallow. 3 words stared back at him from the page. You were warned. The chandelier overhead shuddered. A draught, perhaps, or something else. From somewhere beyond the door the floorboards creaked, not from age, but from the weight of something or someone moving. The great bay window stood like a solemn witness to the past night's horrors, its glass misted with the first breath of dawn. Nestled in the curve of its alcove sat a chair, an elegant yet time-worn relic of another age, its upholstery still creased from its last occupant. And there in its silent embrace, Professor Edmund Langley lingered, not in life, but in the twisted tableau of death. His posture was unnervingly still, his head tilted at a grotesque angle, as if listening to some final whispered secret. Spectacles hung askew from one ear, their cracked lenses catching the muted morning glow. His eyes, once alight with relentless curiosity, were now vacant, reflecting only the creeping light of an indifferent world. One hand lay slack upon the chair's carved armrest. The other clutched something rigidly to his chest. A codex, its cracked leather binding clutched in fingers stiff with the rigor of death. The pages, brittle with age, bristled with frantic inked scrawlings, as though the professor had been transcribing a revelation only moments before his breath ceased. Hargreaves, the estate's caretaker, stood frozen, the tray in his hands forgotten. A single porcelain cup teetered, then fell, shattering against the marble floor with a piercing crash. The sudden sound ruptured the heavy stillness, sending a shudder through the vast chamber. Within moments, footsteps echoed from the corridor. Miss Hathaway, the housekeeper, appeared first, her hurried steps faltering as she beheld the dreadful scene. Behind her came Sloane, the butler, his usual unshakable composure momentarily cracking. Miss Hathaway gripped the doorway, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. "Dear heavens," she whispered, her fingers trembling at her mouth. Professor Langley, Sloane, though ever composed, hesitated before stepping forward. His voice, when it came, was tightly controlled. "He's dead." Hargreaves swallowed hard. "Stone cold," he muttered. "Must have been for hours." Miss Hathaway swayed slightly, her grip tightening on the doorframe. "But I saw him last night. He was awake when I made my rounds." Sloane turned sharply toward her. "What time was that?" "Just after 10, she murmured, her gaze fixed upon the professor's lifeless form. "He was reading." "As always." Hargreaves shook his head, still holding that wretched book, like it meant something. As one, their gazes drifted downward, settling upon the codex. The yellowed pages bore the frenzied imprints of a desperate mind, cryptic symbols, erratic crossings out, feverish underlinings. The ink, unsettlingly fresh, had barely dried. Miss Hathaway took a hesitant step closer. "What is that?" Sloane did not answer. His eyes had moved to the desk nearby, where scattered notes lay in carefully curated disorder. The professor had been deep in his research, engrossed, frantic, unwilling to tear himself away. What had he found in those last moments? And had he in the end been alone? Hargreaves exhaled unsteadily. Perhaps he wasn't alone at all. Miss Hathaway let out a sharp breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the frame. "Don't say such things," she snapped. "This house has had enough ghost stories." Sloane remained silent, his gaze fixed upon the professor's unmoving hand. He did not believe in ghosts, but something about the scene was deliberate, calculated. The professor had been writing, right up until his death. Had he been interrupted? Had he unearthed something meant to remain buried? And, more chillingly, who had ensured his silence? The discovery of Edmund Langley's body settled over Hawthorne House like an unshakable fog, thick and suffocating. The grand estate, usually wrapped in the quiet hum of routine, now pulsed with whispers, quick glances, and the rustling movement of those who wished to see, but not to be seen. By the time the first constable arrived, a well-meaning but unprepared man from the village, more accustomed to missing livestock than murder. The library had become a stage. The unwilling players had taken their places. Lady Helena Hawthorne had retired to her sitting room, her expression unreadable. Was she in mourning, or merely in thought? Miss Hathaway had seen to the curtains being drawn, adjusting the staff's duties with a quiet efficiency, as if willing the household to resume its usual order. But despite her efforts, all attention had fixed upon the library doors. And in the corridor beyond them, hushed voices wove together in anxious speculation. "A burglary," Sloane stated, his voice clipped and composed. The window in the west wing was left ajar. Someone must have entered under cover of night. Across the room Dr. James Atwood, the visiting scholar, stood by the fireplace, fingers drumming idly against the rim of his teacup. His expression was unreadable, but there was something too measured in the way he held himself. And yet, he mused, if one were to burgle an estate such as this, why then would the only object disturbed in the entire room was the book, an ancient tome of immeasurable value, still locked in the dead professor's rigor-stiffened grasp. Sloane's fingers ghosted over his cuff as he murmured, almost to himself, a very deliberate book. Across the dimly lit parlor, Dr. James Atwood raised a single brow, his gaze sharp over the rim of his untouched teacup. Deliberate indeed. The manuscript, more than the corpse itself, had become the focal point of speculation. Bound in cracked leather, its pages bore cryptic inscriptions, feverish annotations, and symbols that meant nothing to the untrained eye yet had consumed Professor Langley's final hours. It was no secret that he had been obsessed, unable, or unwilling to part with his research. The question hung thick in the stale air. Was it what he had discovered, or what he had yet to uncover, that had cost him his life? Atwood set his cup down with a measured clink. A curious burglary, if it was one. No valuables taken, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and yet a man is dead. His voice held the faintest note of amusement, though it did not reach his eyes. Miss Hathaway, standing rigid at the edge of the room, twisted the fabric of her apron until her knuckles turned white. Perhaps the intruder was interrupted, Sloane suggested, though his own words felt hollow. Atwood tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Or perhaps, he said smoothly, there was never an intruder at all. A sharp exhalation cut through the charged silence. Edward Hawthorne, languidly sprawled in an armchair near the fire, let out a slow, mirthless chuckle. Lady Helena's only son, a man whose name was never far from whispered scandals, dragged a gloved hand through his dark hair, feigning boredom. "Ah, here it comes," he drawled, stretching his legs. "The inevitable moment where someone implies that I killed the poor professor." His words, light with mockery, did nothing to mask the tightness in his jaw, the restless flicker in his gaze. The silence in response was its own kind of accusation. "You argued with him," Sloane finally said, the words measured, yet weighty. It was not an outright condemnation, but it landed like one. Edward exhaled sharply through his nose, rubbing his jaw. I argue with everyone. You should hear me at the club. It's a miracle I haven't been murdered myself. But you resented him, Atwood observed, his tone deceptively mild. Edward met his gaze without flinching. I resent many things, Dr. Atwood, chief among them, being trapped in a house where my own mother looks at me as though I am already a ghost. The words hung there for a fraction too long. Atwood studied him, calculating, and the professor. Edward gave a slow half smile, though it did not reach his eyes. You may find this difficult to believe, but I don't make a habit of murdering academics. I'm indifferent to most things, but killing seems a bit excessive, even for me. Miss Hathaway's sharp intake of breath betrayed her disapproval of such a flippant remark, yet Atwood remained impassive. And yet, the doctor continued, you had more reason than most to want him gone. The tension in the room tightened, an invisible noose. Edward, however, did not take the bait. With careful, practiced ease, he plucked a cigarette from its silver case, tapped it against his palm, and lit it. A slow exhale of smoke curled through the dim air. Then by all means, he murmured, arrest me. The jest was a thin veil over the undeniable truth. The murmurs had already begun, the whisper of guilt curling around his name like ivy on stone. And Edward, for all his indifference, knew it. Some miles away, beyond the rolling hills and mist-veiled fields, Agatha Marlowe sat in a quiet tea shop, stirring sugar into her cup with slow deliberation. The low hum of conversation swirled around her, fragments of local gossip, idle chatter, half-truths woven into speculation. And then a name surfaced like a ripple breaking the surface of a still pond, Langley. Her stirring slowed imperceptibly. Murdered, you say? The words were spoken across the room, but she caught them as surely as if they had been addressed to her directly. Setting her spoon aside, she lifted the teacup to her lips, taking a measured sip. The bell above the door chimed, allowing in a gust of autumn air, and with it a fresh flurry of whispers. Outside, the distant silhouette of Hawthorne House loomed against the slate-grey sky. Its ivy-cloaked walls stood silent, its great windows like the eyes of a creature that watched without blinking. It was a house steeped in history, in secrets, and now in death. A modest motorcar rattled up the gravel drive, drawing the attention of the footman lingering near the entrance. The vehicle came to a stop with a soft crunch of stone. From within a figure emerged, a woman of unassuming stature, her coat neatly fastened, her hat secured against the brisk wind. Agatha Marlowe took in the house before her, her gaze steady. It was a fine house, a proud house, a house with the scent of secrets woven into its very walls. She adjusted her gloves with quiet precision. Whatever had transpired within its corridors, whatever had drawn the professor to his untimely end, one thing was certain. Hawthorne House was waiting, and so was she. Constable Hughes hesitated, shifting uneasily as he regarded the woman before him. Miss Marlowe, is it? He asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. I was told you wished to assist in some capacity. Agatha Marlowe smiled, though the expression did not quite reach her eyes. Oh, nothing of the sort, young man, she replied with the kind of ease that only masked a sharper intent. I merely have an appreciation for history. Houses such as this, she gestured vaguely toward the looming estate behind them, carry the weight of many stories, and one does hear things, of course. The constable shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his cap. Yes, well, the village does love its gossip, especially where the gentry are concerned. Miss Marlowe's gaze remained mild, though her fingers smoothed over her gloves with deliberate care. Quite. But tell me, Constable, do you believe it was a simple burglary gone wrong, as some have suggested? Hughes hesitated. Well, the professor was clutching that book, wasn't he? Someone might have thought it valuable. Curious, Miss Marlowe murmured, her head tilting ever so slightly, that a thief should take nothing else. A house like this, and not so much as a silver candlestick gone missing, no broken locks, no signs of forced entry, and yet the professor is dead. The constable frowned. But that book, yes, the book. Her voice was soft yet insistent, and the professor himself, a guest in this house, a possession of sorts, one might argue. And now, like so many things that vanish without a trace, he is no longer here. A gust of wind whispered through the estate grounds, rustling the ivy along the stone walls. The constable swallowed, feeling as though he were being led into a conversation he did not quite understand. Well, he managed uneasily, the investigation will sort all that out. Indeed, Miss Marlowe murmured, I expect it will. With that she turned toward the estate, its heavy oak doors left slightly ajar, as though the house itself were reluctantly beginning to let its secrets slip. Asterisk, 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 Hawthorne Manor was not simply old, it was a house of memory and concealment, a place where whispered voices had seeped into its very foundations, where unseen hands had once drawn heavy drapes against the encroaching night. Agatha Marlowe stepped through the dim corridors, her gaze brushing over the ancestral portraits lining the walls. The faces in the paintings, frozen in oil and time, seemed to follow her with quiet scrutiny. The house smelled of polished wood, aged parchment, and something more elusive, like dust disturbed after too long a stillness. When at last she entered the library, it did not disappoint. The grand room stretched before her, lined with towering shelves weighed down by books long untouched. The air was thick with the scent of ink and paper, the whispers of forgotten knowledge clinging to every spine. A circular reading table stood at the center, its dark surface reflecting the weak morning light that crept through the stained glass windows. But despite its grandeur, the library did not feel abandoned. No, something here had been disturbed, and not merely by death. Agatha's gaze swept the room, cataloguing details with practiced ease. A chair, pushed back slightly from the desk, as if someone had left in haste. A quill, knocked askew, its ink bottle teetering dangerously close to spilling. A fine layer of dust on the shelves, except in one place, where fingers had traced their way across a row of books. And then, most curious of all, a draught, faint but unmistakable, whispering through the room despite the windows being firmly shut. A shift in the heavy velvet curtains, so subtle it could have been dismissed as a trick of the light. But Agatha Marlowe did not dismiss things. She watched, she listened, and she understood. Ah, she murmured under her breath. How very interesting. The measured sound of approaching footsteps echoed behind her, each click deliberate, composed. Lady Helena Hawthorne entered, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. Miss Marlowe, she said smoothly, gliding across the library floor with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I trust you find our estate accommodating. Agatha turned, offering a pleasant smile. A beautiful home, she said lightly, and one that holds its age well. Lady Helena's expression did not waver, but her eyes, sharp as polished steel, flickered toward the table where the professor had last sat. We are quite proud of its history. Yes, Agatha murmured, letting her gaze drift once more to the curtain where the faintest ripple still stirred. And history, dear Lady Hawthorne, has a most peculiar way of refusing to stay buried. A family that values tradition. Agatha Marlowe folded her hands before her, her gaze drifting toward the grand oil portraits that lined the study walls. Tradition can be a fine thing, she mused. And yet, history has a way of pushing back, does it not? There was the briefest hesitation, just a flicker, a pause where one should not be. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, matriarch of the estate, retained her perfect composure, but Agatha saw the subtle tightening of her fingers around the delicate strand of pearls at her throat. History, Lady Eleanor said smoothly, is a record of what we choose to remember. Ah, Agatha murmured, tracing a gloved hand along the gilded bindings of the books behind her. But it is often what we forget, or try to, that proves most troublesome. Tell me, Lady Blackwood, how well did you know Professor Hargrave? A whisper of tension. The pearls shifted between Lady Eleanor's fingers, their cool surface rolling against her skin. He was persistent, she admitted at last, her voice measured, a man of intellect certainly, but perhaps too interested in things best left alone. And what things might those be? Agatha inquired, her tone light, almost conversational, a polite smile. Our family's affairs, Miss Marlowe, are just that, our own. Agatha met her gaze unflinching. And yet history has a peculiar way of revealing itself, she said softly, especially when one tries too hard to bury it. A subtle shift in Lady Eleanor's stance, barely perceptible, the lift of her chin, the squaring of her shoulders. You must forgive me, Miss Marlowe, but I have no taste for riddles. Oh, neither do I, Agatha assured her. I much prefer answers. Lady Eleanor excused herself then, a careful retreat rather than a dismissal, and Agatha turned her attention to the others in the household, first to Mrs. Linwood, the housekeeper, a woman of rigid propriety, whose starched uniform and composed expression could not quite conceal the tension beneath. Agatha studied the slight tremor in the woman's clasped hands. You were the last to see the professor alive, were you not? She asked gently. Mrs. Linwood's throat bobbed. I only brought his tea, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He was working late, he always worked late, and yet he never made it to his chambers. The housekeeper's gaze flickered toward the heavy reading chair by the fire, the place where Professor Hargrave had been found. He said he had one final note to make before retiring for the night. And was he alone? A hesitation. Barely a breath, but Agatha caught it. I believe so. You believe so, Agatha repeated. Or you know so. Mrs. Linwood's grip on her apron tightened. I heard voices, she admitted, her voice faltering. But it's a large house, sounds carry. Voices, Agatha echoed. And yet, when the professor was found, he was quite alone. A silence thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Agatha turned, stepping closer to the towering bookshelves, where the scent of parchment and old ink filled the air. And then there it was again, that whisper of a draught so faint it might have been ignored. But Agatha had built her life on noticing what others did not. She trailed her fingers along the carved wood, pausing at a faint seam in the paneling. With the lightest pressure, there was a hush, a shift, then a quiet click. A sliver of darkness appeared as the panel gave way, revealing the narrow mouth of a hidden passage. Mrs. Linwood gasped. I had no idea. Agatha turned, offering a small knowing smile. No, my dear, but I suspect someone did. A breath of cold air stirred from the secret corridor, curling through the dim room like a whisper from the past. Somewhere in the depths of Blackwood Hall, a truth lay waiting, one that refused to stay buried. The book was old, its leather cracked, its pages unevenly yellowed with age, but not as old as it wished to appear. Agatha Holloway turned it over in her hands, running a gloved finger along the spine, noting the way the binding glue had been unevenly reapplied, the way certain pages had been carefully inserted, their texture slightly mismatched. A forgery, but why, and by whom? She retrieved a magnifying glass from her bag, holding it over the professor's marginal notes, hurried scrawls in Latin, half translations, fragmented thoughts. Yet there was something else, something odd. Certain strokes of ink had smudged in a way that ink should not, as though another substance had been introduced. A slow smile touched her lips. Curious, she murmured. As she straightened, her gaze drifted across the dim library, catching on the grand candelabrum near the stone hearth. At first it was unremarkable, a bronze relic worn with time, its wax melted in uneven rivulets, but something was off. The residue at its base, faint, powdery, familiar. She knelt beside it, brushing a finger over the fine dust. She had seen this before. Not wax, not ash, but a particular kind of poison, one that left no taste, no immediate symptoms. Professor Harrow had not been shot, nor struck down, nor strangled, but that did not mean he had died naturally. She exhaled, adjusting her gloves, as she walked the perimeter of the room, and then that whisper of air, so faint it might have been overlooked. But Agatha noticed what others did not. She pressed a palm against the towering bookshelves, feeling along the grain of the wood, until her fingertips met the subtlest groove, a seam just barely perceptible. She leaned in, the scent of aged paper, of dust undisturbed for decades, mingled with something else, something colder, something alive. A hidden passage. She turned back toward the center of the room, where the household was waiting, shadows flickering in the firelight. The first interview was with Lady Rosalind Ashford, the matriarch of the estate, seated stiffly in the high-backed chair by the hearth, her hands perfectly still upon the armrests. "You knew the professor well," Agatha observed, a measured pause, "as well as one can know a man who refuses to leave things buried. And did you find his persistence troubling?" Lady Rosalind tilted her head slightly, a glint of something unreadable in her gaze. "Scholars are often intrusive, Miss Holloway. They see the past as a puzzle, but not all puzzles should be solved." Agatha smiled faintly. "And yet he must have found something to have stayed here so long." The woman's fingers twitched, just once, against the fabric of her gown. "He was convinced," she admitted at last, "that our family records held some great revelation. I found it tedious. And yet, someone did not." Silence. A silence that stretched just long enough. Agatha let it settle before turning her attention to Julian Ashford, the son of the house, who had been pacing when she entered. At her gaze, he sighed, collapsing into a chair. "Let me guess," he said dryly. "I'm the obvious suspect." "Obvious suspects," Agatha mused, "are rarely the ones we need to worry about." Julian let out a short laugh. "Refreshing change." "You disliked the professor," she noted. "I disliked the mess he made," Julian admitted, rubbing a hand through his hair. "He sifted through our history as if he were searching for buried treasure. He thought he could rewrite the past with a single discovery. And could he?" His gaze flickered to her, something tightening in his jaw. "You tell me, Miss Holloway." She watched the restless motion of his fingers on the chair's edge, the tension in his shoulders, anger but not guilt. "You're furious," she observed, "but not with him." A flicker of something, regret, uncertainty. "What does it matter now?" he muttered. "He's dead." Agatha studied him a moment longer. "It matters," she said softly, "because the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried." The final interview was with Mr. Finchley, the estate's long-serving curator, a man of rigid precision, his silver-rimmed spectacles glinting in the candlelight. "The professor consulted you often," she began. He adjusted his cuffs. "Scholars ask questions. I provided what I could." "And what precisely could you provide?" He hesitated. "A fraction too long. History," he said at last. And the professor was determined to read between its lines. "Did he?" Another pause, this one heavier. "I think," Finchley said carefully, "he was on the verge of something." A beat of silence. "And now he is dead." Agatha rose slowly, her gaze drifting once more to the hidden seam in the bookshelf. "Yes," she murmured, "and yet I suspect his discoveries did not die with him." The house stood silent, waiting, holding its breath. But secrets once disturbed had a way of demanding to be heard. The estate's archives were vast, a labyrinth of time-worn documents and crumbling correspondence, stretching back centuries. Yet as Agatha Holloway listened to Mr. Ellsworth, the estate's somber and precise curator, she sensed that not all history wished to be uncovered. "Nothing of concern," he had said, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses with the careful deliberation of a man who chose his words wisely. But the hesitation in his voice, the brief flicker of unease in his otherwise impassive expression, betrayed him. And yet, Agatha mused, folding her gloved hands atop the desk, someone thought otherwise, didn't they? A fleeting tension crossed his features, gone as quickly as it had come, but not before she caught it. He cleared his throat. "If there was a secret within these walls," he murmured, "it was not mine to reveal." Agatha studied him for a moment, her sharp gaze unwavering. "Perhaps not," she conceded. "But you knew of it, didn't you?" A pause. Then softer, a whisper of something between resignation and reluctance. "I preserve history, Miss Holloway, but history does not always wish to be preserved." As she stepped away from the interviews, the puzzle pieces began to align. Lady Eleanor, regal and poised, yet too controlled, as though every word, every movement was a calculated performance. Julian, restless and impatient, carrying an anger that did not stem from grief alone, but from something deeper, something unresolved. And Ellsworth, whose unwavering devotion to the past made his silence all the more telling. And then there was the library itself, grand, towering, ancient in its presence yet alive with unseen whispers, its books holding secrets between their brittle pages, its walls not merely built to shelter knowledge, but perhaps to bury it. The room was never truly silent. The books whispered to one another, their pages shifting with the draft. The wooden floors groaned beneath unseen weight, and somewhere lost within the labyrinth of its towering shelves, the past had been rewritten. Seated in the golden afternoon light, Agatha turned the pages of the forged codex with meticulous care. It was a masterwork of deception, its leather binding worn and cracked in all the right places, its pages yellowed with what seemed like time's gentle decay, but beneath her practiced eye, the floors unraveled like loose threads in a tapestry. The ink had not faded in the way true antiquity demanded. The parchment, though aged in appearance, had the stiffness of something not quite as old as it claimed to be. And then there was the marginalia, Latin notes scrawled in a seemingly careless hand, yet something about them was too precise, too deliberate to be the work of a distracted scholar. It was without a doubt a forgery. But the question remained, why? She lifted a magnifying glass from her reticule, her gloved fingers steady as she examined the pages more closely. The ink, dark and bold in some places, had faded unnaturally in others. A chemical reaction, it had been tampered with. She exhaled, pressing back into the velvet armchair. The Professor Harrow, had discovered this book among the Hawthorne collection, and now, he was dead. Had he known what he was looking at the moment he touched it, or had the truth unraveled slowly, luring him in piece by piece until it was too late? And then, just as she was about to close the codex, the light shifted, the setting sun cast long fingers of gold across the pages, illuminating something she had not seen before. She froze, tilting the book slightly. There between the lines of Latin, faint as a whisper, was a phrase that did not belong. Her breath stilled. Carefully, she adjusted the lens, the words revealing themselves like ghosts beneath the ink. What was promised must be buried. A slow exhale escaped her lips. She flipped back through the preceding pages, her movements no longer careful but urgent, her eyes scanning the corners of the text, and there hidden within the margins, their presence barely perceptible, more words. Oath unbroken, debt unpaid, loyalty bound in blood. The heir must never know. The air in the library felt heavier now, thick with something unsaid. The pieces were falling into place. This was no ordinary forgery, it was a replacement. The original codex, whatever it had contained, had not been lost, it had been removed. Deliberately. And this impostor had been put in its place to hide something dangerous. Her fingers rested lightly on the fragile parchment. This book was not simply meant to mislead, it was meant to erase. The professor had found it. He had uncovered what should have remained hidden, and now he was dead. Agatha sat back, adjusting the lace cuff of her sleeve, her mind a whirlwind of conclusions yet to be drawn. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the past, but the past, no matter how deeply hidden, had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. and Agatha intended to unearth it. The secrets of Blackthorn Manor were never meant to be unearthed, and yet, as the candlelight flickered against the damp stone walls, Eleanor Graves could feel the weight of history pressing down upon her, a betrayal long buried, a scandal whispered through generations, and a name carved into the very bones of the estate, erased from the records, but never truly gone. Professor Aldous Grimley had paid the price for uncovering the past. His lifeless body found mere steps from the forbidden archives, a silent warning to those who dared pry too deeply. Standing before the towering bookshelves, Eleanor traced her gloved fingers over the spines of ancient tomes, her mind a whirring machine of deductions and possibilities. If Grimley had discovered something worth killing for, then someone within these walls had a vested interest in keeping it hidden. The method of his murder spoke of precision, calculation. This was no crime of passion but a deliberate act of preservation, an attempt to keep the past where it belonged. Outside, the wind howled through the ivy-choked corridors, pressing against the leaded windows like the restless whispers of the dead, their stories clawing to be heard. By daylight, Blackthorn retained its air of aristocratic grandeur, gilded chandeliers, polished silver, carefully measured civility. But at night, it changed. Shadows deepened, silence stretched taut, and the weight of buried truths thickened the air. Eleanor had spent her life unraveling mysteries, and if there was one thing she knew, it was that the past never remained buried for long. The grand library, abandoned for the evening, held its secrets close. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the heavy drapes muffled the outside world, trapping the scent of aged parchment and something else, something faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably wrong. She ran her fingers along the mahogany bookshelves, searching not for what was visible, but for what was missing. The presence of dust where it should not be, the slight shift of a panel undisturbed for decades. Beside her, Lucian Blackthorn, heir to the estate and the reluctant companion in this endeavor, shifted uncomfortably. "This is absurd," he muttered, watching as Eleanor pressed her palm against an unassuming panel of wood. "If there were secret passages, I would have found them as a child." "Perhaps," Eleanor murmured, "but the best hiding places are the ones we forget to look for." A faint click, the whisper of old wood shifting against stone. Lucian inhaled sharply as the bookcase swung inward, revealing a narrow corridor swallowed in darkness. The air that seeped from within was thick with dust, with decay, with something older than time itself. Eleanor retrieved a candle from the table, lighting it with a practiced hand. The flame wavered as she stepped forward, illuminating the uneven stone walls, the faint glimmer of forgotten relics hidden within the alcoves. Lucian hesitated. "You mean to go in?" Eleanor shot him a sharp glance. "Isn't that rather the point?" His sigh was lost to the hush of the passage as he followed. The corridor forced them to move single file, the damp walls pressing in, the scent of neglect thickening with every step. Then a break in the stonework, an alcove lined with shelves stacked with yellowed ledgers, brittle letters tied with silk ribbons, and a single ornate box with a tarnished clasp. Lucian reached for it, but Eleanor caught his wrist. "Patience," she murmured. "Consider what's missing before we examine what's left." He frowned, glancing at the shelves, gaps in the dust, spaces where something had been removed, recently. Eleanor's eyes darkened. "Whoever killed Grimley," she whispered, "took something from here. And perhaps the codex was never the true prize at all." A chill ran down Lucian's spine, though he told himself it was only the cold. When they emerged back into the study, the household had settled into an uneasy quiet, the distant murmur of conversation fading beneath the weight of what they had found. Eleanor wasted no time. She summoned Lady Rosalind Blackthorn and Dr. Victor Ashford, the visiting historian, to the drawing room, a space that over the past days had become more of an interrogation chamber than a place of leisure. Lady Rosalind entered with her usual composure, her every movement deliberate, her expression schooled to perfection, yet there was a tautness to her features, a flicker of something unreadable behind her sharp eyes. Dr. Ashford, by contrast, was restless, his fingers tapping against the arm of his chair, his gaze darting too quickly between Eleanor and Lucian. The weight of unspoken truths settled heavy in the room. Eleanor leaned back, her fingers laced together, her tone deceptively mild. "I thought it prudent to revisit a few matters," she said, her eyes sharp beneath her calm exterior, "particularly regarding Professor Grimley's work here." The air in the room seemed to shift, a near imperceptible disturbance, like the first tremor before a storm. Secrets, Eleanor knew, were like embers smoldering beneath ash, and tonight she intended to stoke the fire. The air inside Blackwood Manor felt heavier than ever, thick with something unseen, something that had been buried for too long, and was now clawing its way back to the surface. Eleanor Graves watched Lady Rosalind carefully, noting the tension in her hands as they gripped the armrest just a little too tightly. "I don't see what more there is to discuss," Lady Rosalind said, her voice crisp but not quite steady. Across from her, Dr. Victor Ashford let out a dry, humorless laugh, his fingers drumming against the table. "Oh, I do," he murmured, eyes flicking toward her with a knowing sharpness. Lady Rosalind turned her head just slightly, her expression still composed but something flickering beneath it. "Excuse me, you dismissed Grimley as a nuisance," Ashford continued, his voice low but charged with something almost triumphant. "But he was on to something, and I rather think you knew it." Eleanor caught the way Lady Rosalind's fingers tightened just a fraction more, how her breath shallowed, and how, across the room, Lucian Blackwood stood in the shadows, watching but saying nothing. "Why do you think she knew?" Eleanor prompted, her voice light, but her eyes sharp. Ashford's gaze snapped to hers. "Because Grimley wasn't the only one searching." A heavy silence fell between them, the kind of silence that meant something had struck its mark. Lady Rosalind did not move. "You overestimate me, Doctor Ashford," she said at last, her voice controlled but thinner now, the edges of her mask beginning to crack. "I don't think so," Ashford countered, his tone sharpening like the edge of a blade. "Grimley found something, didn't he? Something you would rather have stayed buried." The air in the room shifted, thick with tension. Lady Rosalind lifted her chin, still composed but no longer unshaken. "I have nothing more to say." Eleanor tapped a single finger against the armrest, studying her. "Curious, isn't it," she murmured, "that when faced with difficult questions the guilty always retreat rather than argue." A single beat of silence. Then Lady Rosalind rose from her chair with an elegance so deliberate it nearly concealed the urgency in her movements. "This conversation is over," she declared, before sweeping from the room, leaving only the ghost of her perfume behind. Ashford let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "She's hiding something." Eleanor didn't take her eyes off the door. "Without question," she said lightly. "The real mystery is whether it's about Grimley's death, or something much, much older." Ashford turned to her, frowning. "You think this has nothing to do with the murder?" Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, her mind already moving several steps ahead. "I didn't say that," she murmured. "I only said that some secrets have multiple layers." Later that night, Eleanor stood alone in the glass-walled conservatory, the candlelight flickering against the darkened panes as the wind outside pressed ivy against the glass like listening ears. Lucian found her there, his footsteps hesitant. "Miss Graves," he said quietly. She turned, the dim light catching in her steady eyes. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." He hesitated, then, in a voice lower than before, murmured, "I don't think I want to be like my mother." Eleanor studied him, saying nothing. "I thought I didn't care," Lucian continued, his jaw tightening. "About the house, about the name, but there's something about all this, about Grimley's death, about the damn secrecy, that makes me sick." Eleanor regarded him for a long moment, then spoke quite gently. "You have the look of a man who wishes to set something right." Lucian swallowed hard. "I think I do." She nodded, her expression unreadable. Then, my dear, let's see to it that you have the chance." Outside, the wind stirred again, pressing its whispers against the glass, because the past would not remain silent for much longer. Blackwood Manor had always carried an air of mystery, but at night, it became something else entirely. The grand corridors, lined with portraits of ancestors long dead, seemed to close in, their painted eyes watching, waiting. The stillness pressed against the house like a held breath, as if something within its very walls was listening. Eleanor had spent her life listening to what silence concealed, and she knew that the darkest hours often whispered the clearest truths. So, beneath the veil of night, she made her way back to the library. A dying fire cast low, amber light, its embers barely clinging to life. Shadows danced restlessly along the towering bookshelves, shifting as she moved. She paused, her gaze flicking toward the armchair where Grimley had been found. His body slumped as if he had merely dozed off, but the disturbance in the dust told another story. The room had been tidied into perfect order since then, but Eleanor knew that perfection was always an illusion. The real secrets were never where people expected them to be. She removed her notebook, flipping it open with careful hands, her every observation precise. Every detail had a place. Every inconsistency had a purpose. Her first stop was the heavy bronze candlestick near the fireplace, elegant, unremarkable at first glance. And yet, from her bag, she retrieved a small magnifying glass, leaning in, studying the surface. A thin film of dust had settled unevenly, as if something had been wiped away, recently. She touched a gloved finger to the rim of the holder. There, barely visible in the dim light, a powdery residue clung to the metal. Eleanor's expression did not change, but internally, a thread of suspicion tightened. Poison. Not in the drink, not in the food, but in the very air Grimley had breathed as he sat there, oblivious to the death seeping into his lungs. A slow, silent execution, cold, calculated, and worst of all, undeniably deliberate. The past had begun to whisper its secrets, and soon Eleanor knew it would begin to scream. The air inside Ashbourne Manor was heavy with secrets, the kind that clung to the walls like damp, whispering in the silence. Charlotte Vale stood in the grand library, where time itself seemed to have settled into the very grain of the wood, listening. The fire in the hearth was burning low, casting restless shadows that flickered like unseen figures lurking in the corners. Her gloved fingers traced the edges of an ornate writing desk, feeling for the smallest inconsistency, and there it was, a nearly imperceptible gap where the drawer did not quite align with the frame. She retrieved a fine steel hairpin from her pocket, slipping it into the seam with practiced ease. A soft click. The drawer slid open, releasing a breath of stale paper, ink and something fainter, acrid, almost metallic. Inside, letters lay folded with meticulous precision, their edges crisp with careful handling, but it was the small glass vial tucked into the corner that held her attention. The rim was stained, not with ink, not with dust, but with something more insidious. She did not touch it. Instead she noted every detail, the way it had been placed as if forgotten, yet deliberately concealed. Whoever had hidden it had been cautious, but not cautious enough. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, each clue forming a trail that led deeper into the dark. Outside, the estate stood beneath a sky of cold glittering stars, its windows dark, its corridors silent, but it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of watchfulness. Somewhere within these walls lay the truth, waiting to be unearthed, and Charlotte Vale had never been one to let the past rest undisturbed. She turned away from the desk, her footsteps soundless against the marble, moving toward the study where Mr. Alistair Morden had spent decades tending to the manor's archives. He was not an easy man to corner, practical, private, a man who preferred the company of his books over that of people, but now he sat opposite her in the dimly lit study, his hands clasped atop a heavy ledger. His posture was rigid, his expression carefully composed, but Charlotte had spent years learning to read what was left unspoken. "I do hope I haven't disturbed you, Mr. Morden," she said pleasantly, settling into her chair. "You are not an easy woman to ignore, Miss Vale," he replied, his voice measured. She smiled, "A skill I have refined over the years." Her fingers tapped lightly against her notebook. "I have been thinking, you see, about hidden things." There a twitch of his fingers, so slight it might have gone unnoticed, but she saw it. She leaned forward just enough to unsettle him. "Tell me, Mr. Morden, how long have you known about the passage concealed behind the library shelves?" A flicker, a single instant in which his careful mask faltered, his lips parted, not in response but in instinct, the impulse to deny, to deflect, but he was a careful man, and careful men did not answer without calculation. "I beg your pardon," Charlotte sighed, almost sympathetically. "Come now, Mr. Morden, I believe you are a man of great loyalty. It is in many ways an admirable quality, but true loyalty does not mean concealing the truth when it might prevent further harm." A long silence. Then very quietly, Morden exhaled, his gaze dropping briefly to the firelight reflecting in his spectacles. "You are correct," he admitted. "I have known about the passage for years, and yet," Charlotte murmured, "you failed to mention it when asked." His jaw tightened. "What would you have had me say?" "This house is built upon secrets, Miss Vale. Some are best left undisturbed." A dangerous philosophy, she noted, her voice gentle but firm, one that I dare say got poor Mr. Lorne killed. At that, Morden's fingers gripped the edge of the desk. "I did not kill him. Did you?" Charlotte's tone was mild, but her gaze was unyielding. Morden swallowed. Then, after a long pause, he said, "No," but the hesitation, the flicker of something else in his eyes told her that while he might not have been the one to place the vial, he knew far more than he was willing to say. Outside, the wind stirred through the ancient trees, whispering against the manor's stone facade, as if the house itself was waiting for its buried truths to be spoken aloud. Charlotte Vale intended to make sure they were. The night pressed against the towering spires of Blackwood Manor, the wind howling through its ivy-cloaked corridors like a restless spirit mourning its secrets. A storm gathered beyond the hills, its distant thunder an ominous prelude to the reckoning within. In the dim glow of candlelight, Eleanor Whitmore sat with deliberate stillness, her gaze fixed upon the assembled figures in the drawing-room, each a player in a game they did not yet realize had already begun. Across from her, Victor Alden lounged in the high-backed chair, his fingers idly tracing the rim of a crystal glass, his nonchalance an artful mask over something more calculated. To his right, Lady Evelyn Lancaster, poised but tense, her gloved hands folded in her lap as if to restrain something unspoken, and beside her, the brooding Alexander Hawthorne, his frame silhouetted against the hearth's flickering light, his expression carved from stone. Eleanor adjusted her gloves with quiet precision before speaking. "Dr. Langley's death was no accident," she murmured, her voice a thread of steel wrapped in silk. A heavy silence fell, save for the rain beginning to tap against the tall windows. It was neither impulse nor mere misfortune, it was deliberate. A careful orchestration by someone who needed him silenced. Lady Evelyn exhaled sharply, shifting in her seat. "You speak as though you already know who." Eleanor's lips curved faintly. "I speak as though the truth is impatient, and if one listens carefully enough, it whispers its secrets even in the absence of confession." Victor chuckled, but there was no mirth in it. "And who, pray tell, do you suspect?" Eleanor studied him for a beat longer than was comfortable. "Ah," she said at last, "but suspicion was never the point, was it? The real question is, who were we meant to suspect?" The fire crackled, a log splitting with a sharp hiss. Alexander's jaw tensed. "You think someone wanted to frame me, a statement, not a question." "Not just you," Eleanor said smoothly, her fingers tapping once against the armrest. "They ensured the illusion of multiple possibilities. That is how the most effective misdirections work. Too many choices dilute the truth. The rain intensified, drumming against the glass like impatient fingers. Victor leaned forward, his expression shifting ever so slightly. "And what truth have you uncovered, Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor tilted her head, the shadow of a smile ghosting her lips. "That Langley did not die because of what he knew, he died because of what he was about to uncover." A flicker of movement, Evelyn's grip tightening on her gloves, Alexander's gaze sharpening, Victor's carefully neutral expression hardening at the edges. "And what exactly was that?" Evelyn asked, her voice quieter now. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the bookshelf behind them, the one with a single slightly misaligned volume. "A secret buried so deep," she said, rising with measured grace, "that someone was willing to kill for it." And with that she moved toward the shelf, her gloved fingers hovering over the spine of the book that did not quite belong. The storm outside roared its approval, as with the barest pull, the hidden mechanism clicked, revealing the darkness waiting beyond. The storm raged against the towering silhouette of Blackwood Estate, rain lashing at its ancient stones like fingers desperate to unearth buried secrets. Inside, the great library, once a vault of knowledge and silent contemplation, had become an arena where the weight of unspoken truths pressed heavier than the tomes lining the towering shelves. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the center, her gaze sweeping over the figures gathered before her, each a piece in the puzzle, each unaware of how close they stood to the abyss. Alexander Graves, the brooding scholar, leaned against the marble fireplace, his expression unreadable, but his tension betraying him in the way his hands curled into fists. Lady Rosalind Fairchild, ever composed, sat with her back straight, but her fingers fidgeted with the fabric of her gown, a nervous tell. And Victor Langston, the charming yet inscrutable historian, met Eleanor's gaze with something between amusement and challenge. "We've been circling the same conclusions for too long," Eleanor said, her voice calm but edged with something sharper. "Dr. Lansing's death was not an act of passion or impulse. It was planned by someone who understood not only the value of secrecy, but the art of misdirection." Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the shadows that stretched unnaturally long against the walls. Rosalind scoffed, though there was a tightness to it. "And who, pray tell, do you believe is our mastermind?" Eleanor tilted her head, watching her carefully. "That is the wrong question, Lady Fairchild. The real question is, who were we supposed to suspect?" A heavy silence fell, punctuated only by the distant toll of the grandfather clock in the hall. Victor chuckled under his breath, the sound devoid of humor. "Ah. So this is where you begin dismantling our carefully built illusions." Eleanor stepped closer, the soft rustle of her dress the only sound in the cavernous space. "No, Mr. Langston, this is where I reveal that you were never the hunter in this game, you were the bait." Victor's smirk faltered, a fleeting crack in his carefully composed mask. Alexander straightened from his position by the fireplace, his eyes narrowing. Rosalind's fingers stilled, her breathing almost imperceptible. "Dr. Lansing was not murdered because of what he had uncovered," Eleanor continued, watching their reactions with calculated precision. "He was murdered because he was about to realize what he had overlooked." The fire crackled behind her, the light casting flickering shadows that seemed to shift and writhe as if the very walls of Blackwood Estate had begun to listen. "And what exactly did he overlook?" Alexander's voice was low, measured, but there was something else beneath it, a quiet apprehension. Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the great oak desk near the far wall, where an open book lay, its pages rippling in the breeze from an unseen draft. "A pattern," she murmured, "a name that should not have appeared, a truth that had remained buried for decades." She turned back to face them, her eyes locking onto Rosalind's, and the one person who had the most to lose if it was ever brought to light. The storm outside roared, a sudden gust rattling the windows as if protesting the revelation. Rosalind inhaled sharply, but before she could speak, Victor let out a slow disbelieving laugh. "Of course," he muttered, shaking his head, "it was never about hiding the past, it was about controlling the future." Eleanor nodded slightly, and someone was willing to kill to ensure that control remained unchallenged. Another peal of thunder rolled through the night, and in that moment, the game shifted. The pieces had finally fallen into place, and the truth, relentless, inevitable, was ready to be revealed. The rain pounded relentlessly against the windows of the dimly lit study, the flickering of the old chandelier casting long wavering shadows across the room. At the head of the massive oak table, Agatha Marple stood with an air of quiet authority, surveying the gathered individuals who seemed to shrink under her gaze. The air was thick with anticipation, each person in the room aware that the moment of truth was imminent. Lady Helena Hawthorne, as regal as ever, sat poised with her hands folded neatly in front of her, but there was a subtle unease in her eyes, a hint of something barely concealed beneath her composed exterior. Edward Hawthorne, who had been silent for most of the evening, fidgeted in his chair, his knuckles white from gripping the armrests, a nervous energy radiating from him. On the far side of the room, Dr. James Atwood, the renowned scholar, leaned forward ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing with suspicion as he watched Agatha carefully, his scholarly detachment giving way to a barely perceptible tension. The others, Mr. Lon, the curator, Miss Hathaway, the housekeeper, and a few of the other staff members stood or sat, their faces a mix of curiosity, dread, and guilt, some struggling to mask the rising fear that had begun to bubble beneath their polished facades. "I trust you all know why we are gathered here," Agatha began, her voice smooth and controlled, a slight yet purposeful pause hanging between each word. "It is time to unearth the truth, to reveal who among us was responsible for Professor Langley's death." A sharp breath drew in from the room, a collective shift as if the air had thickened. "When I arrived at Hawthorne Estate," Agatha continued, her eyes scanning the faces around her, "I had no intention of being swept into a murder investigation. Yet the truth, as it often does, has a way of rising to the surface. It refuses to remain buried, no matter how hard one may try to keep it hidden." She allowed the weight of her words to sink in before she added softly, "Professor Langley's death was no accident. It was no mere robbery gone wrong. This was the work of someone with a clear and deliberate purpose, a murderer motivated by fear, not greed." The wind howled outside as though in agreement, rattling the old windows and shaking the very foundation of the room. Agatha picked up a delicate silver candlestick from the table, her fingers tracing the edge as she held it up for all to see. At first glance, she mused, her voice calm, it would appear the professor simply collapsed, the victim of an unfortunate health crisis. But upon closer inspection there were inconsistencies. She paused, watching as Edward shifted in his seat, his eyes widening ever so slightly at her words. "The ink in the professor's codex," Agatha said, her voice taking on a slight edge. It reacted unusually, as if disturbed by an unseen presence. It was not a simple accident, but rather the sign of something far more insidious. The room was silent as they absorbed her words, the tension in the air thick enough to be felt. "And then," she continued, "there was this." Agatha held up the candlestick again, her fingers delicately turning it in the dim light. "Dust, you see, settles in predictable patterns, but on this particular object, the dust had been disturbed. It was as if someone had handled it recently, someone who wanted to make sure it was left in plain sight." She set the candlestick down and turned toward the desk, where the professor's hidden drawer had been left ajar. From within she withdrew a small glass vial, its contents faintly visible in the low light. She held it up between two fingers. "A fine powder," Agatha said, her tone crisp and unyielding, "a toxin nearly undetectable, not one meant to kill immediately, but rather to slowly poison the mind and body over time." The silence in the room grew oppressive, each person seemingly holding their breath as Agatha's words settled into their bones. "This, my friends, was the true method of murder. Professor Langley did not die from a sudden attack. He was slowly poisoned, a little at a time, until the poison finally took hold. She set the vial down carefully before looking directly at Dr. Atwood. "And you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 100 suspicions, "had more to gain from Langley's silence than any of us." Dr. Atwood stiffened, his jaw tightening as he attempted to mask the growing unease. "What are you suggesting?" He scoffed, his tone sharp, but there was an underlying tension that betrayed him. "You, Dr. Atwood," Agatha continued smoothly, "were the one who most fervently directed our suspicions toward Edward Hawthorne. Yet you were the one who stood to lose everything if Langley's discoveries came to light." Atwood's eyes darted around the room, his composure beginning to crack. "That's ridiculous," he spat. "We were colleagues, friends." Agatha's eyes sparkled with a knowing glint. "But Langley was on the brink of overshadowing you, wasn't he?" she pressed. "His research had the potential to change everything, while yours was fading into the background. Perhaps your friendship was not as strong as you made it out to be." Atwood's fingers twitched involuntarily at the armrest, a clear sign of his mounting frustration. Agatha stepped closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "You had access to the professor's private notes, his most sensitive research. And you knew exactly how to remove him from the equation, just as you knew the value of what he had uncovered." The room held its breath as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, the truth finally drawing itself into sharp focus. In the midst of the storm, the murderer stood revealed, and all that remained was for Agatha Marple to deliver the final blow. The storm raged outside, a relentless howl rattling the stained glass windows of Blackwood Manor. Inside the dimly lit drawing room, Eleanor Graves stood poised at the head of the long oak table, her expression unreadable as the household sat in rigid silence. The air was thick with unease, the flickering chandelier casting restless shadows over anxious faces. Lord Victor Blackwood reclined in his chair, his cold grey eyes betraying nothing. Across from him, Lady Margaret Blackwood sat rigid, her fingers clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. Dr. Felix Mercer, the visiting historian, watched intently, his brow furrowed as if already calculating possible outcomes. The other members of the household, from the loyal steward Mr. Harding to the enigmatic maid Miss Beatrice, each bore expressions of apprehension, some tinged with guilt, others with fear. Eleanor's voice, calm and deliberate, sliced through the charged silence. "A house such as this harbors many secrets, but murder is the darkest among them," she said. A crack of thunder punctuated her words, and an audible breath was drawn somewhere in the room. "Professor Aldous Fairfax did not die by accident," she continued, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of a silver serving tray. "Nor was it the work of some faceless intruder. No, this was an act of intention, of calculation." She turned her gaze toward Lord Blackwood, watching the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "He was silenced," she pressed, "because he discovered something he was never meant to know." Eleanor lifted a delicate crystal decanter from the sideboard, tilting it ever so slightly. The room watched, tense, as she let a single drop of amber liquid fall onto a white cloth. Within moments the spot darkened, turning an unnatural shade of green. A sharp intake of breath followed. "A rare toxin," she murmured, "one that leaves little trace, its effects mistaken for a failing heart." Her gaze swept the table, but there were signs. Oh yes, there were signs. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The missing page from his journal, the ink-stained cuff, the faint scent of bitter almonds on the edge of a glass. She let the words settle before turning to Dr. Mercer. "And then of course there is you, Doctor," she said, her voice carrying an almost pleasant finality. Dr. Mercer stiffened, though his lips curved into a forced smile. "Surely you don't mean to suggest—" "Oh, but I do," Eleanor interrupted smoothly. "You see, it was you who suggested heart failure before the doctor had even examined the body. It was you who insisted that his research was inconsequential, that he was wasting his time here, and most importantly, it was you who had the knowledge, no, the expertise, to administer a poison so subtle, so precise." A hush fell over the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, its embers glowing like distant eyes watching from the dark. Dr. Mercer exhaled, a slow, measured sound, and then he laughed, a dry, humorless chuckle that sent a chill through the air. "Well," he murmured, shaking his head, "I suppose I should be impressed." Eleanor merely smiled, her sharp eyes glinting. "Indeed, Doctor," she said softly, "but not as impressed as I am by how very predictable you turned out to be." The wind screamed against the windows, the storm reaching its fevered peak. And in the heavy silence of Blackwood Manor, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The storm had finally begun to retreat, its fury spent, leaving the vast corridors of Ashwick Manor steeped in a heavy, expectant silence. The great drawing room, once a sanctuary of whispered conversations and clandestine glances, now stood as a tribunal of unspoken truths. At the center of it all, beneath the watchful gaze of a dozen flickering sconces, Eleanor Graves rested her gloved fingertips lightly upon the edge of the polished writing desk. The room's occupants sat rigid, their expressions a careful balance of dread and curiosity. Lord Henshaw's glass of brandy remained untouched, his knuckles whitening against the armrest of his chair. Beside him, Lady Frances stood with her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, her gaze flitting from one suspect to another. Dr. William Hargreaves, the renowned scholar, had ceased his restless fidgeting, his sharp eyes fixed upon Eleanor with an intensity bordering on defiance. And then there was Miss Lydia Whitmore, the housekeeper, whose trembling hands twisted the corner of her apron, her breath shallow as though she feared the very air would betray her. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice a measured thread of certainty. "Murder is never the act of impulse we wish it to be," she murmured. "No, it is a slow, creeping thing, nurtured in shadow, built upon intention." She moved her hand ever so slightly, the light catching upon the delicate dusting of fine powder upon the desk's surface. "You see," she continued, "our unfortunate Professor Alden Winthrop was not struck down in a fit of rage, nor felled by some reckless hand. No, his murderer was patient." She turned her sharp gaze to Dr. Hargreaves, who had grown terribly still. They did not need to act in haste, because they knew exactly when his body would be at its weakest. A shudder of realization rippled through the room. Eleanor stepped back to the ornate candlestick beside the professor's final resting place, her fingers brushing lightly against the silver base. "This," she said, "was the instrument of his demise, not the candlestick itself, of course, but the residue that clings to its surface, the very same fine powder I found scattered across his study, laced within his evening tea, and woven into the very pages of the research he so desperately sought to protect." Silence reigned, thick and impenetrable. "A substance meant not to kill in an instant," Eleanor went on, "but to erode, to weaken, to make every breath a labor, every movement an unbearable weight." She let the thought settle before turning her gaze toward Miss Whitmore. The housekeeper flinched as though struck. "And who," Eleanor asked, her voice both gentle and unyielding, "would know the professor's habits better than the very woman who prepared his tea, who ensured the order of his papers, who knew precisely when he would sit at this very desk, his defenses at their lowest?" A strangled gasp escaped Miss Whitmore's lips, her face drained of all color. Lord Henshaw leaned forward, disbelief warring with dawning horror. "You," he breathed. But why?" Eleanor tilted her head ever so slightly. "Because the professor was more than a scholar," she answered for her. "He was a man who pried too deeply, whose discoveries threatened the past as much as they promised the future. And some secrets," her eyes gleamed in the firelight, "are worth killing for." Miss Whitmore's lips trembled, but it was Dr. Hargreaves who exhaled first, shaking his head with something almost like admiration. "You always were too clever, Miss Graves." Eleanor smiled then, a ghost of a thing, and rested her hands neatly upon the desk. "Yes," she murmured, "I often find that to be the case." Outside the storm had all but faded, leaving only the faint echo of wind upon the windows, a whisper of the secrets that had at long last been unearthed. The storm had not merely raged outside, it had seeped into the very walls of Blackthorn Manor, settling in the shadows, pressing against the whispering corridors where secrets had long been entombed. The great hall, with its towering bookshelves and air thick with the scent of aged parchment and forgotten sins, now held its breath. At the heart of it stood Eleanor Vale, her gloved hand brushing against the cracked spine of an ancient tome. Resting upon the desk, a book that had never meant to be found. Professor Aldridge did not come here seeking knowledge alone, she said, her voice a precise thread of certainty that cut through the silence. He came because he had begun to uncover something that should have remained buried. A flicker of unease rippled through the room, a shifting of weight, a sharp intake of breath. Sir Benedict, forever composed, forever guarded, tightened his grip on the armrest of his chair, his gaze unflinching. Beside him, Lady Vivienne's fingers trembled against the rim of her untouched glass, her lips pursed as though holding back words she dared not speak. And then there was Graham Calloway, the ever-loyal steward of Blackthorn, his expression carved from stone, but his pulse, Eleanor did not miss it, was thrumming violently against the fragile skin of his throat. A deception was arranged, she continued, stepping closer to the desk, where the supposed codex lay open. A forgery meant to mislead us, a clever ruse, designed to turn our eyes away from the truth. But the truth, she murmured, trailing a delicate finger across the surface, where an almost invisible film of powder clung, has a way of clinging to things. The realization sank into the room like a weight, and Calloway, though he remained still, exhaled, slow, measured, but unmistakably resigned. "Poison, Mr. Calloway," Eleanor said, her voice gentle but unyielding, not one that acts swiftly, but one that erodes, that lingers, that weakens over time until the body is no longer strong enough to fight. Professor Aldridge did not die from a single impulsive act. He died because someone ensured his fate was sealed long before his final breath. A gasp from Lady Vivienne, a sharp indrawn breath from Sir Benedict. Calloway did not deny it. No, he merely closed his eyes for a fleeting moment before opening them once more, his weariness settling into his bones. "So you have seen through it at last," he murmured, his voice carrying neither regret nor anger, only inevitability. Sir Benedict surged to his feet, disbelief and fury battling in his expression. "You mean to say it was you?" Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "It is always the one who goes unnoticed," she said, stepping forward. "You did not kill for greed, nor for ambition. You killed because you believed, in some twisted, tragic way, that you were protecting this house." Calloway let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "You understand far too much, Miss Vale." "Indeed I do," she replied softly. "You had spent decades safeguarding Blackthorn's secrets, and when Aldridge began to dig, when he came too close to unearthing what should have remained lost, you saw only one path forward. You did not want to kill him, but you believed you had no choice." The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, before Calloway finally sagged in his chair, his mask crumbling at last. "He would have destroyed everything," he whispered. "The reputation, the legacy, this house, this family, it all would have crumbled." Eleanor's expression did not change. "Ah, but that is the great folly of men like you, Mr. Calloway," she murmured. "In trying to preserve the past, you have doomed the future." A distant crack of thunder echoed beyond the manor walls, as if the storm itself bore witness to the confession, and then it was over. Calloway, his crime laid bare, was led away, his face unreadable, his burden unchanged. The household remained, trapped in the echo of what had been revealed. Sir Benedict stood motionless, raking a hand through his dishevelled hair, while Lady Vivienne stared vacantly into the fire, her expression one of quiet devastation. Eleanor watched them for a moment before speaking, her voice light, though edged with something deeper. "You were integral to solving this, Sir Benedict," she said, glancing toward him. He let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "I hardly feel that way," And yet it is true, she insisted. While others were content to let the past dictate the present, you sought the truth. That is no small thing. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Perhaps, he conceded. Then with a weary smile, he added, but I rather think I shall be avoiding libraries for a while. Eleanor's lips curved ever so slightly. Oh my dear boy, she said, I do hope not. After all, knowledge is essential in keeping oneself out of trouble. And as the storm finally faded into the horizon, the first light of morning stretched across Blackthorn Manor. The weight of old secrets had finally been lifted, their grip upon the house loosened at last. Eleanor stood by the grand window, sipping her tea as the mist rolled away, revealing a landscape untouched by the ghosts of the past. Sir Benedict approached, a fresh cup in his hand. You'll be leaving soon, I suppose, she smiled, accepting the tea. Yes, dear, but something tells me the manor will remember me for quite some time. He chuckled, then hesitated before speaking again, his voice softer now. Miss Vale, do you ever feel that justice is never quite enough? Eleanor considered this, her gaze lingering upon the dawn. Justice, she mused, is rarely perfect, but it is necessary. A pause then, even quieter, and sometimes simply knowing the truth is its own kind of justice. He nodded, as though it was an answer he could live with, and as the sun rose fully over Blackthorn Manor, Eleanor Vale, with the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, knew that once again, the truth had found its way home. The night had passed, but its ghosts had not faded. Blackwood Manor stood against the bleak light of dawn, its towering silhouette swallowed by mist, the air thick with the remnants of secrets that had been unearthed yet refused to settle. Inside the house exhaled, yet its breath remained shallow, burdened by the weight of revelations that had torn through its walls like a storm. The great hall, once a sanctuary of order and refinement, now bore the echoes of fractured certainties. The library, where deception had been unraveled and truth laid bare, felt altered, no longer a place of whispered confessions but of undeniable consequence. The books, untouched on their mahogany shelves, seemed to mourn the knowledge they could not protect. The fireplace, once warm, now cast only cold embers, and the air carried the scent of something final, something that had ended, though no one dared name it aloud. The household had gathered, their voices hushed, their movements hesitant, as though afraid the house itself might collapse under the weight of what it had witnessed. Lord Everard Thorne, ever the silent spectre of Blackwood, stood by the window, his fingers resting against the frost-kissed pane, his reflection a ghost of the man who had once been unshaken. Lady Meredith sat rigidly in the high-backed chair, her spine iron straight, her face unreadable, but her fingers, oh how they trembled, against the rim of a half-finished glass of sherry. Across the room, Dr. Felix Whitmore, so recently burdened by suspicion yet now cleared, sat with his head bowed, rubbing slow circles against his temples, as though the weight of his own miscalculations had settled too deeply into his bones. And the staff, scattered in pockets throughout the house, spoke in hurried murmurs, eyes darting toward the corridors, as though the very walls might listen, might remember, might hold them accountable. It was Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, who finally broke the silence, her voice thick, frayed with something close to grief. I never would have believed it, she whispered, not after all these years. She shook her head, pressing a hand to her lips, as though the words themselves carried a weight she could scarcely bear. Lord Everard inhaled sharply, but when he spoke, his voice was measured, controlled, too controlled. Perhaps we should have, he murmured. Whitmore lifted his gaze, frowning. You cannot blame yourself for this, Everard. But Everard did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the grey sky beyond the window, the first hints of sunlight failing to pierce the dense fog. This house was built on secrets, he said, more to himself than to anyone else, layer upon layer, until they became part of the walls themselves, and we let them remain there. We let ourselves forget them. He exhaled, straightening, his expression unreadable. But that time is over now. He turned, his gaze meeting Meredith's. We cannot rewrite the past, he said, but we can decide what will define us. Meredith studied him, something unreadable flickering across her face. You knew, she said softly, didn't you? Everard did not immediately answer. Then finally, he gave the barest nod. I suspected. Her expression darkened, and yet you said nothing. A silence stretched thin and sharp, before he spoke again, quieter this time. Would you have? Meredith's jaw tightened, but she had no answer. Because the truth was, she wasn't sure. Across the room, Whitmore let out a dry, humorless chuckle. What a fool I was, he muttered. Meredith turned toward him, raising an eyebrow. Pardon, he gestured vaguely, his lips twisting into something close to self-reproach. All this time, I thought myself the cleverest man in the room, so certain that I had unraveled the truth, so confident that Everard was guilty, so certain, in fact, that I never stopped to question how conveniently the evidence had pointed me in the wrong direction. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I pride myself on logic, on reason, and yet when it mattered most, I let my own arrogance blind me. From the far side of the room, Eleanor Vale, silent until now, spoke, her voice soft, yet edged with quiet certainty. Ah, she murmured, but that is the nature of truth, Doctor. We see what we expect to see, until the truth decides otherwise. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. I rather suspect, he admitted, that you've given me more insight into myself than all my research combined. Eleanor's lips twitched, but there was no amusement in her eyes, only something numb. A good mystery, she mused, has a way of holding up a mirror, don't you think? The morning stretched on, and with it, the weight of the night before did not dissipate, but it did change. It was no longer an oppressive force, no longer a thing that held them captive. Instead, it had become something to be faced, to be understood, to be carried forward, but not as a burden, rather as a reminder. Everard, after a long silence, turned to Eleanor. You were right about me, he said at last. Eleanor lifted her gaze from her tea, her expression calm but expectant. Oh, he let out a breath, shaking his head as though at a loss for words. You said I was not meant to be the villain of this story, he exhaled, a wry, self-deprecating smile ghosting his lips. And yet, for a time I believed I was. Eleanor considered him for a moment before replying, her voice gentle but firm. Villains are not born from circumstance alone. Lord Everard, she said, they are born from choices. And you, despite everything, chose the truth. The words settled over him like a quiet absolution. Outside, the sun had begun its slow ascent, its light stretching across the manor's cold stone walls, breaking through the mist at last. And as Eleanor Vale sat back, the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved settling within her, she knew once again that the truth had found its way home. A heavy morning mist clung to the Blackwood Manor as its ancient doors creaked open. The house, long accustomed to silence, now held a strange, uneasy stillness. The storm that had raged both outside and within had passed, leaving behind the weight of the truth that had been unearthed. The library, once a sanctuary of intellect and whispered secrets, now bore the scars of the revelations it had hosted. The air was no longer thick with mystery, but with the undeniable reality of what had come to light. Caswell, the long-trusted confidant of the Blackwood family, was seen leaving in the custody of the police. His face was unreadable, yet when his gaze met Eleanor Dane's in the dim hallway, a fleeting shadow crossed his features, not of regret, not of sorrow, but of inevitability. He had seen this moment coming for a long time. The truth had finally caught up. In the drawing room, a silence hung heavy. Lady Margaret Blackwood sat poised in her chair, her eyes lingering on the dim glow of the chandelier before dropping to the pearl necklace she absently twisted between her fingers. Across from her, Sir Reginald stood near the fireplace, his usual unreadable expression marred by something more troubled, something unresolved. "Doctor," Lawrence, a man who had only hours ago been entangled in suspicion, sat slumped in an armchair, pressing his fingertips to his forehead, as if the weight of the night had outmatched all his knowledge. The servants lingered at the edges of the room, speaking in hushed, uncertain tones, as if every word was a test of their courage. It was Eleanor who spoke first. For years, her voice wavered, heavy with the weight of disbelief. For years, and I never suspected. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips as though silencing any further words before they could escape. Lady Margaret inhaled deeply, her voice measured but resolute. "Perhaps," she murmured after a pause, "perhaps we should have, Doctor." Lawrence lifted his head, watching her closely. "Are you blaming yourself?" His voice carried an edge of incredulity, but Lady Margaret's gaze remained fixed beyond the window, where the mist had begun to thin. "This house," she said, voice laced with the weight of history, "has harbored secrets for generations, secrets so deeply woven into its walls that we mistook them for its very foundation." She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly before turning her attention to Edward. "But now, it is time," she paused, each word deliberate, "that we decide they will not rule us any longer." Edward hesitated, as if absorbing the words before speaking. "You suspected, didn't you?" Lady Margaret held his gaze for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod. "I had my doubts, and yet you said nothing." The question lingered, heavy and unspoken for too long. Silence stretched between them before she finally answered, "And if I had, would you have listened?" Edward had no response. He wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. Dr. Lawrence let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. "What a fool I was," he muttered. Lady Margaret's eyes flickered toward him, sharp. "Excuse me, I was so convinced of my own brilliance," he said, the ghost of a smile, self-deprecating, resigned on his lips. "I was so certain that Edward was guilty, that I never once questioned why the pieces fit together so conveniently." Eleanor, quiet until now, finally allowed herself the faintest of smiles. "We see what we want to see," she murmured, "until the truth forces us to see otherwise, Doctor." Lawrence studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "I believe," he said, voice low, "you may have just taught me the most important lesson of my life." Eleanor's eyes held a knowing glimmer. "The best mysteries," she said, "always turn the mirror on those who seek to solve them." As the day unfolded, the weight of the night's events did not entirely dissipate, but it was no longer suffocating. It was simply something to be understood, to be faced. Edward exhaled, then turned to Eleanor. "You were right about me," he admitted, the words quiet but clear. She took a small sip of her tea, the ghost of a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Oh," Edward let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head, "I should have faced the truth sooner." Eleanor set her cup down, her expression unreadable yet oddly warm. "Growth," she mused, "is a strange thing, Mr. Blackwood. It often begins only when we stop running." Edward nodded, something lighter in his expression than had been there before. "Will you stay?" Eleanor smiled, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "Oh no, my work here is done." Edward chuckled softly. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Eleanor rose, adjusting her coat as she moved toward the grand oak doors. "But before I go," she paused for just a moment, "write to me, if you ever find yourself slipping into the dark again." Edward stepped forward, inclining his head slightly. "I will." And with that, Eleanor Dane, with the quiet satisfaction of a mystery resolved, and a house left to find its own path forward, took her leave. As she stepped into the crisp morning air, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the mist, touching the manor with a warmth it had not known in years. Because for the first time in a very long time, the past had finally been laid to rest. A lingering mist wrapped itself around the old Ashbourne estate, as the first light of dawn seeped through its ivy-clad walls, whispering against the heavy glass panes like a ghost reluctant to depart. The house had long been a mausoleum of silence, its history buried beneath polished wood, and whispered regrets. But now something had shifted. The great library, once thick with the weight of secrets unspoken, no longer carried the suffocating hush of deceit, but rather the quiet hum of something restless, something waiting. Edward Ashbourne stood before the cold hearth, its embers long dead, his gaze distant yet sharp, as if seeing the room for the first time. He exhaled, a breath that carried the weight of years, before turning at the soft sound of approaching footsteps. Lady Eleanor Ashbourne, poised and unreadable as ever, crossed the threshold, her presence commanding yet tempered by a rare unfamiliar gentleness. "The library feels different this morning," she observed, her voice smooth but laced with a quiet undertone of thought. Edward allowed himself the faintest smile, a ghost of something long forgotten. "Perhaps," he murmured, "because for the first time it does not feel haunted." Her gaze swept the vast shelves, where books had once hidden truths too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The mahogany desk, worn by time and tragedy, no longer bore the imprint of unfinished confessions and desperate last words. It was simply furniture now, a relic of a past that had finally relinquished its hold. A moment passed between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken things, before Eleanor's fingers lightly trailed over the edge of a chair. "I have spent a lifetime believing that silence preserves a legacy," she admitted, her voice quieter now, almost to herself. "That to protect a name, one must erase every flaw, conceal every weakness, never speak of what should remain buried." She inhaled sharply, then exhaled, as though shedding a weight that had long bound her. "But I see now, silence does not preserve a legacy, it poisons it." Edward swallowed, something tightening in his throat. "Mother," she lifted a hand, not in command, nor in dismissal, but in something far more rare, a gesture of understanding. Her fingers, cool yet steady, rested lightly on his forearm, a touch that spoke of bridges long burned, but not beyond repair. "We have much to mend," she said, her voice neither pleading nor regretful, but firm. "But I would not have us remain strangers." A silence stretched between them, not cold, not heavy, but full of quiet possibility. For once Edward had no retort, no armor of words to deflect or evade. He simply nodded. And Lady Eleanor, though she did not smile, gave his arm the faintest squeeze before stepping back. Outside, the mist was beginning to lift, and the estate, for so long trapped beneath the weight of its own past, felt, if only just slightly, lighter. In the parlor, Miss Evelyn Mercer, ever observant, sipped her tea as she watched Edward stand by the great window, his posture less burdened than before. "A fine morning, wouldn't you say?" she remarked, her tone laced with knowing amusement. Edward turned, one brow lifting. "Is that your way of saying, 'I told you so'?" Miss Mercer's lips twitched. "Oh dear boy, I would never say such a thing." He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "No, I suppose you wouldn't." She regarded him for a long moment, her gaze gentle yet certain. "You will be quite all right, you know." Edward studied her, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the shadows in his gaze had begun to ease. "I rather think I will be," he admitted. Miss Mercer smiled, setting her cup down with a delicate clink. "Then I believe my work here is done." Outside, the golden light of morning streamed through the windows, bathing the old house in a glow it had not known in years. And for the first time in a very long while, Ashbourne Estate had room for something new, a future, a fresh start, and perhaps, just perhaps, the quiet redemption of a name that had long been burdened by its past. A golden hush settled over the Ashbourne Estate, as the dawn stretched long fingers of light through its towering windows, chasing away the ghosts that had lingered in its halls for generations. The air was different now, not merely lighter, but charged with something unspoken, something waiting to be acknowledged. Edward Ashbourne stood at the threshold of the great library, his fingers brushing absent-mindedly against the polished wood of the doorway, as if grounding himself in the reality of what had been unknown. The secrets, the lies, The carefully constructed illusions that had shrouded this place for so long had finally unraveled, leaving behind only the stark, undeniable truth. A quiet sigh escaped him, a sound of something releasing, though whether it was regret or relief, even he could not quite tell. Behind him, the soft click of heels against marble announced Miss Evelyn Mercer's arrival. She had always possessed a way of appearing precisely when she was needed, though never before had Edward understood the true weight of her presence. "You look as if you've come to a realization," she observed, her voice as measured as ever, though there was an undeniable warmth beneath its surface. Edward exhaled, as if surprised by his own thoughts. "I suppose I have," he admitted. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if she had been expecting this all along. "Your father would have been pleased," she said, her tone softer now, edged with something almost imperceptible. Edward chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Let's not get carried away, shall we?" For the first time in a long, long while, Miss Mercer smiled. The morning sun filtered through the grand windows, illuminating the fine lines of her expression, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction resting there. She had always been fond of moments like this, the quiet settling of things after the storm. As she turned toward the entrance hall, Edward stepped forward, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "You're really leaving then?" he asked. She adjusted the brim of her hat with an air of finality. "Oh yes, dear boy, I do believe my work here is quite finished." He hesitated, as though searching for the right words, then with a quiet sincerity, said, "I suppose I should thank you." A glimmer of amusement flickered in her gaze. "That would be most appropriate." He smirked, shaking his head. "You knew, didn't you, that it wasn't me?" Miss Mercer's eyes twinkled with something knowing, something timeless. "Oh, Edward," she sighed, "I find that the obvious culprit is almost never the real one." "No, dear, I knew from the very start that you were a great many things, but a murderer was not one of them." A breath of laughter escaped him, low and weary but lighter somehow. "You really are remarkable, Miss Mercer." She patted his arm in the briefest of gestures. "Yes, dear," she replied smoothly, "but let's not make too much of a fuss about it." And with that, she stepped toward the grand entrance, where the first full light of morning stretched across the Ashbourne grounds, casting golden rays over the mist-laden hedges and the manicured lawns. The estate, though still standing as a monument to its past, now seemed poised towards something else, something unwritten, something waiting. Miss Mercer paused at the top of the stone steps, taking in the sight. The library, once a place of shadows, now merely a room filled with books. The house, no longer a prison to its own ghosts, but a home once more. With a final satisfied nod, she stepped forward, her work complete, her quiet triumph unspoken. And behind her, Ashbourne Estate stood bathed in the soft glow of a new dawn, no longer bound by what had been but instead, for the first time in years, open to what could be. The morning air carried the lingering hush of a night's buried whispers as Edward Ashford stood at the threshold of Ravenshade Manor, his fingers tightening at his sides. The weight of the past still pressed against the estate's towering facade, its ivy-laced walls steeped in silent remembrance, but for the first time he did not feel smothered by it. The shadows of old secrets still clung to the corridors within, but they no longer felt insurmountable, just remnants of a history that could not be changed, only understood. Near the entrance, Miss Evelyn Harrington, ever composed, stood with a quiet air of finality, watching him with an unreadable expression. The early light softened the sharp lines of her face, but her gaze remained as keen as ever, as if she could see beyond the moment to the things yet to come. She did not speak at first, allowing the silence to settle between them, like dust in an undisturbed chamber, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then, with a voice quieter than before, Edward asked, "Do you believe in redemption, Miss Harrington?" His words were careful, deliberate, less a question, more a hope spoken aloud. She tilted her head slightly, considering, the flicker of a knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Oh my dear, I do not merely believe in it," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years, of stories unspoken, and lives altered. "I have seen it with my own eyes." A soft breeze stirred the morning air, rustling through the towering oaks that lined the driveway, their branches whispering against the wind, murmuring echoes of old confessions. "You have seen what happens when men chain themselves to the ghosts of their past," she continued, her tone gentle but unwavering. "It consumes them, binds them. It is easy to live in the shadow of what has been, to wear it like a shroud. But I have also seen what happens when one chooses, hesitantly, fearfully, but chooses nonetheless, to step forward." Edward let out a slow breath, the faintest tremor of realization settling over him like the morning mist lifting from the grounds. His whole life, he had carried the weight of old expectations, of disappointments both imagined and real. Perhaps for too long, he had allowed himself to believe in the version of himself that others had painted. But the truth, he was beginning to understand, was far more complex. "Then maybe it's time I did the same," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of something breaking free, something long held in place finally shifting. Miss Harrington regarded him for a long moment before nodding approvingly, the smallest glimmer of satisfaction in her gaze. "A very sensible decision," she said, her voice touched with something that might have been pride. He exhaled, something between relief and finality passing over him. "And you?" he asked, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Off to uncover another mystery." A quiet chuckle escaped her, a sound as light as the morning wind. "Oh no, dear boy, I think I shall return to Rosewood, to my library, my garden, and perhaps a rather excellent pot of tea." He smirked, shaking his head. "A well-earned rest then." She patted his arm lightly, her touch as fleeting as the dawn. "Indeed. Though I do hope you'll keep me informed of any scandalous occurrences. One never quite knows, with houses like these." At that Edward laughed, an unburdened sound, warm and genuine, free of the weight that had long clung to him, like ivy on the manor walls. It was the first true laugh in years, and it surprised even him. Miss Harrington stepped into the waiting carriage, pausing only once to cast one final glance at Ravenshade Manor. The house, though steeped in its own history, no longer seemed shackled by it. The past could not be rewritten, but perhaps it could be understood, and in that understanding, there was always the possibility of something new. The carriage rolled forward, its wheels crunching softly against the gravel as it disappeared down the long winding drive, vanishing beyond the line of trees where the mist still clung in low curling tendrils. Edward remained standing at the entrance, watching until even the faintest trace of it was gone. Slowly he turned back to the house, the vast silent halls waiting beyond the threshold. The air inside would still be thick with memories, the weight of generations still imprinted in the very walls. But now for the first time, he did not feel as though they were pressing down on him. He inhaled deeply, letting the scent of damp earth and morning air fill his lungs. It was not yet a home, not quite, but perhaps one day, it would be. And for now, that was enough.